It's easy today to completely misunderstand Richard Nixon. He was not just a product, I should say, of the rejection of Vietnam. There really was a silent majority out there, maybe not a majority, but there really was a lot of Americans who were fed up with the civil rights movement. They felt it had gone too far. They were angry about the violence in the streets. Many of them, of course, were just racist. And many of them, the country had been drifting to the left since really 1930, but certainly with FDR's election in 1932. And by 1968, many Americans are just done with it. 1968 did not bring the return to normalcy that Nixon had promised. Nixon essentially was promising to take us back to the 50s or maybe even the 20s. But instead, it created a culture war or intensified the already existing culture war even longer. But there really were conservatives in America who were freaked out by protesters, both civil rights and anti-war. And the protesters, of course, wanted to break the power of the elites in the war and achieve racial and economic justice and reform the political system. And these two groups were very much at odds with each other. And then you have minority groups demanding their rights. And there was also a significant movement of escaping a dehumanized technocracy, this kind of highly ordered, highly structured, bureaucratic modern world. And all these things were swirling around, and it created a combustible mixture that really is going to lead to a sense of coming undone in the late 1960s and early 70s. There's a quote, if you're not in my class, you might check out. In 1962, Michigan students had formed the Student for a Democratic Society, and they issued the Port Huron Statement, which we'll look at a quote from here in a second. And they called for a new politics, and they expressed a disillusionment with the way the United States was heading. They wanted to start with reforming college. This was followed in 1964 with the Berkeley free speech movement. And what they meant was the right to cuss anytime you want, all the time. And this was dramatic. This was on the news all over the place. It would have been very upsetting to mainstream Americans. And at one point at Berkeley, a student was handing out civil rights flyers, pro-civil rights flyers. And the police came to arrest him. And then students, angered by this, feeling it was a violation of his free speech, surrounded the police car. You see it there on the right. And then students began giving speeches about how they felt about the university and the police and their policies. Here's Mario Salvo giving us which turned out to be a pretty famous quote.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working.
As the situation in Vietnam deteriorates, these protests over just generally unhappiness with American society will grow until riots and takeover of buildings on college campuses become common. In Colombia, kids seized the president's office for a few days. A group called the Weathermen prevents a few acts of terrorism against places where they do like corporate research for bombs. But they actually try not to hurt anybody. It's kind of an interesting brand of terrorism. These groups were too radical for most. But they gained in some degree of support as the public turned against the war, as we talked about last chapter. There's the Port Huron Statement. As deferments for graduate students, teachers, husbands, fathers, and others begin to disappear, it had been the case that if you were one of those things, you wouldn't get drafted. But as the war waged on and we needed more and more kids, we began to take those away. Resistance to the graft began to grow, particularly when they started making college kids go. The college kids really got angry about this. And many Americans would choose to go to jail rather than go fight in the Vietnam War. Thousands of Americans will flee to Mexico and Canada. The most famous American to refuse to serve in the war is Muhammad Ali, who had changed his name from Cassius Clay, which freaked out mainstream America enough. But he was stripped of his titles because he felt the war was immoral and refused to take part in it. Burning draft cards became very common, as you see down there. There's a great book by Tim O'Brien who remembers when he got his draft letter. You can take a look at this quote. It's pretty powerful.